I'm sure the honourable gentleman will be withdrawing that comment.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to clarify some of the points the honourable gentleman raised on the other bench. The ZEV mandate policy is a...
We're on the same side. We'll be quiet, won't we?
The ZEV mandate policy, the Shadow Minister mentioned, is a policy of the previous government, of which he is aware. The changes the previous government made were not to the ZEV mandate. They were not pragmatic on it. They changed the destination and kept the fines and the ramp-up and the thresholds exactly the same. So what they did was give no flexibility or pragmatism in how that policy operated, but still undermined the transition, leading to a massive reduction in consumer confidence. And he asks, has the honourable gentleman talked to industry? I was the guest speaker at the SMMT dinner last night. 1,000 people there from every bit of the automotive sector. They are absolutely clear that it's the destination they support. It's the Conservative government, the previous Conservative government's policy as to how this operates, which is causing them the problems. And as I said in the statement, if he was listening, or if he'd read it in advance, 10 days in to this government, we were told this plant was likely to close. It is on this side of the House that we've acted with pragmatism, been willing to look at any part of this policy in order to make sure this outcome didn't happen. The simple truth was that it was too late after 14 years of failure to be able to put this right. So I just have to say to him, with all politeness, he is out of touch with industry, he is out of touch with workers, he's even out of touch with what the previous Conservative government did, and I think that speaks for itself.
Chair of the Select Committee, Liam Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is indeed a hard day for Luton, and I welcome what the Secretary of State had to share with the House today, and I welcome the review that he's announced of the zero-emission mandate. As part of that review, I do hope that he looks again at the perversities of the regime that he inherited that could involve makers of petrol engines in this country transferring credits to companies like Elon Musk's Tesla and Chinese EV makers. But if we really want to make sure that there is a level playing field, Mr. Speaker, why don't we reverse the decision of the last Secretary of State, follow the EU Commission and launch anti-subsidy investigations into Chinese EV makers? The Trade Remedy Authority is ready to go. It just needs the Secretary of State to give the green light.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the Chair of the Select Committee and indeed for our exchanges we had in the committee evidence session yesterday. He is right to say that what we have inherited is a position where how the policy operates, the flexibilities that are contained within it, and the fact that no domestic producer is on track means effectively the transfer he has described is the problem. That is when I say decarbonisation cannot mean deindustrialisation. It's precisely that we've inherited that we are critiquing. Now, we don't want to undermine the transition in the way the previous Prime Minister did, because anyone in industry in this sector will be able to tell honourable members opposite how disastrous that was. But what we need to give is breathing space and making sure that that policy is operating in a way which doesn't have any of the kind of perverse incentives he's described. Now, on the subsidies point and the trade remedies and the potential response from the UK, we've got to bear in mind two things. First of all, the system we've inherited is industry itself, which makes the application for that. I do have powers as Secretary of State to do that, though they've never been used to my knowledge. But we must also remember that the UK automotive sector is a world-class export-led sector. If we were to go in any kind of protectionist route on principle, we've got to bear in mind what it would mean for the markets we sell those vehicles into. If you sell 80% of your product abroad, it is the international export position you've got to consider alongside the domestic market. But I say again, if industry makes that request, of course it would be followed in accordance with the way the system operates.
Clive Jones, the Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for the advance copy of his statement. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I also attended the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders annual dinner, same as the Secretary of State, and greatly appreciated the opportunity to hear directly from a sector that is so important to the British economy. UK car manufacturing brings billions of pounds into our economy and employ hundreds of thousands of people directly and many more thousands of people across their supply chain. They are at the forefront of the green transition and in making transport sustainable for the future via electric vehicles. And most importantly, they are always willing to be frank with me and other politicians, because they reaffirm to me that the industry sees major hurdles on the horizon. And the closure of Vauxhall's 100-year-old factory in Luton is a sign of great troubles ahead. Inevitably, the Conservatives are going to play politics with this announcement. Indeed. But there is still no apology from them for trashing the economy. There is not one moment of reflection that the previous government's policy on electric vehicles was a disaster. It simply did not do enough on infrastructure and incentives. And therefore the government need to fix the Tories' mess. As a starting point, the government urgently need to work with Vauxhall to mitigate what will be a major shock for this area. The government have said that it will fast-track a consultation, but that needs to be fast-tracked today. Mr. Speaker, urgency is the key. When will the consultation start, and when does the Minister expect it to report? The previous government did not do enough to incentivise people to buy electric vehicles, nor did it provide the right infrastructure. What is the government doing to increase sales of electric vehicles and to increase the number of charging points in places like my constituency of Wokingham?
Seriously.
I'm grateful to him for his questions and his observations, and apologies. He's had to hear me speak twice on this in the short passage of time from last night till today. But he asks the Conservative Party to apologise for their economic record. That case stands for itself. But I would also like to know, given how urgently this was presented to us as a new government, what they were doing at the end of the last government. What did they know? What conversations were they aware of? Because certainly what we inherited was a position of extreme frustration from the company. I can't imagine that hadn't been conveyed in some way to our predecessors. There were policies in terms of specific questions in the budget around charging infrastructure. I recognise that's a key part of this, as well as the £2 billion for the R&D Automotive Transformation Fund and the partnership with business that we use that for. He asks on the consultation, obviously that will come from the Department of Transport. Shadow Secretary of State asked about why that's a consultation. Well, the previous government set these policies in primary legislation, so he knows there are processes to follow in order to do that. Any conversation about the thresholds and the existing policy, that is for my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport. But I go back to this point about how the system works, the flexibilities, the allowances, how we can make sure that we are giving automotive manufacturers in the UK a system that lets them get to the transition they want and the consumer wants, but does it in a way which works with industry to enable that transition to happen for the benefit of the United Kingdom.
Rachel Hopkins.
I'm grateful again, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to my register of interest as a trade union member and also someone with friends who have heard that they've lost their jobs. Closing the Luton site will damage our local economy with 600 jobs at risk, more in the supply chain, and workers and families receiving this devastating news just before Christmas. I welcome the comments from the Secretary of State saying decarbonisation must not mean deindustrialisation and the decimation of good, skilled jobs. Will his announcement today move the dial in discussions with Stellantis to help protect the Luton site? And I welcome his tone of taking this seriously compared to members opposite. So will he join me in visiting workers and their trade union representatives at the Luton site to listen to their concerns?
Secretary of State.
Extremely grateful to my honourable friend for her question, and I believe everyone in the House who cares about the automotive sector and working people in this country will share the sentiments that she has put forward about the scale of what this will mean for Luton. I can absolutely promise her, yes, I'll take up her invitation to come with her to the site. I can also promise her the full deployment of my department and indeed all of my colleagues across government to whatever help is required. We are in conversations with Stellantis, as the union are, I believe, about the details of the package that will be presented to the workforce, but of course I'll engage closely with her and her honourable friend for the other side of Luton in order to make sure that it's to the maximum benefit of her constituents in the wider area.
Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a Bedfordshire MP, I know how significant the Vauxhall plant is to our local economy and as a local employer. The Minister has explained how devastating this will be for families locally, not just in Luton, but also in my constituency in mid-Bedfordshire. But the Minister, unfortunately, has said very little about how he's going to support the people that are losing their jobs. Is the Minister concerned that this government's tax on jobs will make it much more difficult to replace the 1,000 manufacturing jobs in Bedfordshire?
Grateful to him for his sentiments, but the straightforward answer to that question is no. This is a skilled and talented workforce. They haven't lost their jobs because of any deficiencies on their part. They have been in a position where the combination of the overcapacity in Europe, I mean, I'll be frank, I believe from the minute we came to office, I think this closure was already what the company intended and has nothing to do whatsoever with government policy. I recognise the pressures on the existing policy we've inherited, hence the pragmatism on our part as a government to make sure that's working for the transition. But I have absolutely no doubt whether these workers choose to take advantage of the relocation offer or are in demand elsewhere. They're brilliant, talented people who will be in demand.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I refer members to my register of interests? Before I start, I want to put on record that the 1,100 people that will be losing their jobs in Luton today deserved much better than the response from the Conservative front bench. It was very far from factual and it was very far from serious. I thank the Secretary of State for their statement and welcome any support for Vauxhall workers and their families who are understandably devastated by Stellantis' decision, especially this close to Christmas. This follows the closure of the Skef plant in Luton North after a century of manufacturing earlier this year. Like them, Vauxhall is, or was, synonymous with Luton. Stellantis' callous decision will impact our whole town, our whole region even. So what support will be offered to not just the skilled and dedicated Vauxhall workers who are losing their jobs, but also to our whole town as a whole to cope with the loss of this manufacturing giant which Luton helped build?
Thursday.
Grateful to my honourable friend for her question as well, and echo the sentiments I gave to her constituency neighbour in my earlier question. The timing of this, I think, the whole decision is regrettable, but the timing is particularly regrettable around it. As I said in my statement, we've done everything we can since the new government came into power on the 5th of July to try to avoid this. I reiterated the offers I had made throughout the negotiating process in terms of both policy flexibility and indeed the potential of new government investment in the site, but regrettably it was not possible to change this decision. The support that I have made clear is available. I reiterate that promise, and I do say, despite in fact I would not want to minimise the impact of this in any way. I believe her area is a place of considerable economic strength, firms in engineering and aerospace, in air travel, in the creative industries. There's a lot to be optimistic about for the future, but that doesn't take away the bitterness of this particular blow for Luton at this time. I recognise that.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I make clear that we on this side regard this as a very grave matter? We are taking this seriously and we are also dealing in facts. Turning then to veracity, can we hear whether or not Stellantis raised the question of the eye-watering ZEV mandate fines? Did they ask for them to be lifted?
I'm grateful to him for his question. Yes, in the conversations we had with them, they raised every aspect of the previous government's policy in terms of the flexibilities, the ability to cap and trade, some of those allowances, what it would mean for the bottom line. And I take those concerns seriously. That's why I'm willing, in a way that does not undermine the destination, to consult on how this policy works alongside my colleague, the Secretary of State for Transport. Because whilst I feel the previous government's aspiration, I understand why they did this policy, I don't think they considered, when the decision was made, the kind of falling demand in Europe which we have seen. And I think we have to work pragmatically across all bits of government to make sure this policy is not having the kind of outcomes which I think many of us who are aware of how exactly this works do share.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer members to my declaration of interest. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement. I'm greatly saddened by the decision. And may I suggest that plant rationalisation, platform rationalisation would have been a major factor. Let's be honest, the industry wanted certainty, but the challenge faced by automotive manufacturers in meeting the ZEV mandate, introduced by the last government, is more stringent than in Europe and most other markets. Put simply, consumer uncertainty was introduced by the last government. So I find the remarks of the Shadow Minister disingenuous. Can I urge the government to introduce more flexibility in the annual targets?
Disingenuous is aimed at a particular person. We don't do that. You've been here long enough, and I'm sure you want to withdraw it immediately.
I withdraw that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Can I urge the government to introduce more flexibility in the annual targets 24 to 29, introduce consumer incentives, and consider redirecting directing any penalties towards EV charging infrastructure and not to Chinese government car companies?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend as well. I think he makes some very good points about the fact that whilst nearly every major market has policies of this kind, ours does operate in a different way, say to, for instance, how the French proceeded with theirs. I agree with him that the major failing of the former Prime Minister's speech was to keep this policy in place but change the destination, which really makes no coherence whatsoever. You should do one or the other logically. To do both undermines confidence and still doesn't give the kind of pragmatic flexibility we're talking about today, and the specific things that he mentioned will all be part of the consultation my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, will lead on.
Sir Julian.
I assure the Secretary of State that the question I'm about to ask I would have put to a Conservative minister equally, and that is this: if all British car manufacturers came together and told the government that they could not possibly meet this 2030 goal, would the government nevertheless persevere in maintaining it as an immovable target?
Well, I would recognise the honourable gentleman's fairness and equity, whichever side of the House he's sitting on, and have no doubts about that. We do listen to industry. We have that very close relationship with them, and that is why we understand that the destination they want is 2030. The pressures of the system are in the next few years because of a situation which I don't believe, and I'm saying this in good faith to Conservative members, I don't believe government ministers at the time considered this set of European and global economic factors in terms of the particular decisions that they make. So that's why we've got to get this balance right. We should also recognise, given we are an export-led automotive producer, that if we weren't being ambitious about the transition, we'd lose our export markets because we wouldn't have anything to sell, because other countries have these policies, and that is where the consumer is going. It's about how we support the transition, and that's where we work so closely with industry.
Antonio Batts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw attention to the Register of Interest as a member of Unite the Union. Can I thank the Secretary of State for coming to the House today on such a difficult day for the car industry. All of our thoughts are with the workers in Luton today. I wanted to ask the Secretary of State to thank him for the work he's doing, engaging with the industry and with unions on a better way forward on electric vehicle targets. This news is really disappointing, but does the Secretary of State agree with me that we can and should be positive about the future of the automotive industry in this country? It matters to me locally as the MP for many, many businesses in the automotive supply chain, as I know it matters to many members across the House.
I thoroughly agree with the content and sentiment of my honourable friend's question. That support this government is committed to is about that transition, but we should be excited by what British manufacturers are doing. We should be excited by what JLR, what Nissan, what Toyota are doing. We should be excited, I mean, in the supercar, the luxury end of the market, from McLaren and Rolls-Royce. I could mention all of our iconic brands. There's a lot of exciting things going on. If honourable members aren't aware of that, these are all manufacturers more than happy to host members of Parliament coming to visit. So I'd encourage people who aren't aware of the situation to do that. But they will explain the pressures they're under in the short term, and they will endorse the change of policy this government is putting forward today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.